Good morning. I hope everyone can hear me. This is Sarah Dubois. Thank you for waiting for us to get started today. And thank you for joining. My name is Sarah Dubois with the National Security Network. I know that there is a derecho of news, so appreciate the time that the speakers and participants have joined. So today our call will focus on nuclear security, U.S.-Russia, ahead of the Putin-Obama bilateral meeting at the G8 summit next week. We will hear first today from Steve Pfeiffer. Steve Pfeiffer is the Director of the Arms Control Initiative at the Brookings Institution and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. Next, we will hear from John Wolfsall. He is the Deputy Director of the Monterey Institute for International Studies. And he is a former special advisor to Vice President Biden for nuclear security and nonproliferation. And finally, wrapping up the call will be Dr. Robert Gallucci, President of the MacArthur Foundation, former U.S. Ambassador at Large, and Dean of Georgetown University School, and former Dean of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. After the presenters speak, we will open it up to questions, and I will give instructions at the time. So with that, Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. Happy to be on this call. Now, it seems to me, looking towards next week, that Presidents Obama and Putin do have a couple of opportunities in the arms control area. And they'll discuss this, I believe, when they meet in Northern Ireland on Monday, although it's looking towards the more important meeting, which I would argue is the full-scale summit that will be held in Russia in September. But I think there are two big opportunities here. One is to reduce nuclear weapons beyond the limits in the New START treaty. New START requires that the United States and Russia each reduce to no more than 700 strategic missiles and bombers, deployed missiles and bombers, with no more than 1,550 deployed strategic warheads. And there's a good question to be asked, which is, do those numbers really make sense at this point, more than 2 decades after the end of the Cold War? Now, in the past, the Obama administration and the President personally have expressed interest in further nuclear reductions, and moreover in reducing not just deployed strategic forces, but bringing in reserve strategic weapons and also non-strategic or tactical weapons, which opens up the possibility, if the Russians agree the first time the United States and Russia discussing their full nuclear stockpiles. And we'll see, the President's giving a speech in Berlin next Wednesday, and there have been some suggestions that he might address some aspects of his arms control agenda in that speech. Now, if they proceed down this route, there are a couple ways they could do it. One way would be to go for what I would call a big treaty, a treaty that would limit all U.S. and Russian nuclear weapons, deployed, non-deployed, strategic, non-strategic, and that would basically allow some trade-offs between different classes of weapons where the sides have different advantages. The Obama administration was interested in this approach in 2011 when they were thinking about what might come after New START. I think one question that may give them a bit of pause, though, is if you're talking about a big treaty, particularly getting into new classes of weapons, new verification requirements, it's going to need time, far more time than the 11 months that it took to negotiate the New START treaty. And there may be a question, could they actually get the treaty done before the President leaves office in January of 2017? So there may be thought being given to a second approach, which might look at perhaps a combination of a treaty approach and some other ways to deal with weapons. You could, for example, take the New START treaty, and if the Russians were prepared to agree, simply amend it to reduce the numbers and keep all of the counting rules and definitions and verification measures, and then treat reserve strategic weapons and tactical weapons in some perhaps other format as you work towards a later treaty on that. So that's one opportunity. The second opportunity is the possibility to resolve differences over missile defense, which the Russians have really made a prerequisite for their consideration of further nuclear reductions. Secretary Hagel announced in March that the U.S. would cancel Phase 4 of the U.S. Missile Defense Plan for Europe. That was the phase in the system that was of greatest concern to the Russians, so this perhaps opens up a door for seeing if the sides could resolve their differences on missile defense. What the Russians are going to have to do to make this possible is to back away from a previous demand for a legal treaty on missile defense, which, quite frankly, the Senate would not be prepared to approve for ratification, and moreover is really not needed given the huge gap between offense and defense. Under New START, we'll have 1,550 deployed strategic warheads, and the plan right now is to have, in 2017, 44 interceptors that could intercept a strategic ballistic missile warhead. So you don't really need a treaty on the defensive side. If the Russians move past that, there's actually lots of convergence in U.S. and Russian thinking going back a couple of years on what a cooperative NATO-Russia missile defense might look like. And that would be not only a better defense for Europe, it would remove missile defense as an obstacle for further reductions, but it could also promote a significant degree of new thinking in NATO-Russia relations. The big question here, though, is are the Russians and are Vladimir Putin prepared to deal? Publicly, the Russians have not been very enthusiastic about future cuts, but they may well have incentives to do so, dealing in part with the economic situation on their side. And it's been interesting in the last couple of months since Tom Donilon visited Moscow, they seem to have moderated the rhetoric and left the door open. We may get an indication on Monday, but I think the more important thing will be what happens in September. Now, one question I think the two presidents are going to spend quite a bit of time on Monday is Syria. And there's no direct connection between Syria, missile defense, and nuclear reductions. But where Syria does affect is the question of the atmospherics. Now, if the sides can manage, if they want to move forward and take advantage of the opportunities for arms control and missile defense progress, they'll find a way to manage their differences on Syria in a way that it should not get in the way. But that's something to be watched. At this point, let me go ahead and turn the talk over to John.
Is are we going to be able to get the Russian Federation to agree to reciprocal cuts as part of a bilateral process? Or are we not going to be able to do so, and in which case are we effectively going to give the Russians a veto over our ability to go down to lower numbers? Or are we prepared to go either independently or to move through some combination of reciprocal, parallel, but not legally binding or codified steps? And I think the President has been very eager, while being very open-eyed about Vladimir Putin and all of his peculiarities, that we do end up in a better place politically and strategically if we can have a parallel agreement with Russia at the beginning to go to lower numbers of nuclear weapons. That not only helps achieve the President's goal of reducing weapons in order to further reduce the role that nuclear weapons play internationally and to support our broader non-proliferation policies, but helps in the goal of ensuring strategic stability between ourselves and the Russians and eventually to multilateralizing the arms reduction process. But underlying all of this, of course, is the fact that what the President is trying to get rid of are weapons that we don't need, and to avoid spending money on these weapons that are desperately needed elsewhere. And you have seen throughout the last year in the budget process the conventional military and, in fact, other parts of the budget pushing very hard against the idea that nuclear missions and the recapitalization of the nuclear triad are somehow above and outside the realm of the ongoing budget debate. And when you look at the potential costs for rebuilding all three legs of our nuclear triad on submarines, on land-based missiles, and on bombers, and the infrastructure to support that, you realize that over its lifetime, that can cost close to $750 billion over the next 35 years. And so that's money that's desperately needed not only for the conventional fighting military, the shipbuilding budget, the re-equipping and replacement of equipment coming out of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, but are also needed for other parts, the VA budget, domestic spending, and Congress itself is twisted around the axle between the budget hawks and the defense hawks in terms of exactly how much we should be spending on the nuclear mission. So this is very much leading into this dialogue with President Putin, who has some of the same dynamics. He has some of the same budget pressures, has some of the same conventional military requirements that are competing with nuclear budgets. And so I think there is an opportunity, as Steve mentioned, because of the overlap in interest, but it depends on whether or not the President of Russia is prepared to deal, or whether, as we have seen in the past, the Russians are going to indicate that, well, you seem to want this more, so we're prepared to wait you out. And at some point, the President will have to decide if he's prepared to go for reductions without a legal agreement with Russia, which, to be fair, has a very slim prospect of passing the Senate at any rate. And so there's not a strong desire on the part of the administration to go for a new treaty unless they know that we can get good Russian cooperation from the beginning. And as Steve said, as long as we know it's not going to get wrapped up into the desire to have a legal treaty on missile defenses, which is just a non-starter in the Senate. So if we can get some agreement quickly, then I think there's a prospect for a treaty that can go down conceivably to as few as 1,000 weapons, strategic weapons as counted under New START. But the question will be, if we can't get that, whether the President is prepared to go alone and say that the military believes we only need this much, regardless of how many weapons Russia has, and because of our own domestic priorities, this is the decision I'm going to make, and see if he can make that stick. So with that, I'm happy to turn things over to Bob Gallucci, who I think is going to talk about a slightly different aspect of the relationship.
Thanks, John and Steve. I'm also happy to have this opportunity to talk and to discuss these issues. So John's right. If nuclear security broadly includes at least two things: one, the central systems and the bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia, it also includes the issue of nuclear terrorism, which is a tad bit sloppier conceptually than is the bilateral arms control relationship. Nuclear terrorism has been identified as at the core of some of the two security summits we've had. It's been identified by presidential candidates, those that have won and those that have lost, as the key national security issue that the country faces. The idea of nuclear terrorism usually captures your imagination because pretty quickly you recognize, unlike nuclear weapons that might be launched from Russia or formerly from a Soviet Union or some other state, we actually have no defense and no deterrent against nuclear deterrence. We really have no defense. We can't be confident we can stop a nuclear weapon from being introduced into the United States, and we have no real reason to believe we can deter terrorists who value our death more than their life with any particular kind of threat. So that focuses us very quickly on fissile material, and I'm going to go right there right now. Nuclear security, for me at least, and for many other people when we think about terrorism, means controlling and limiting access to fissile material for any purpose. So if you think about fissile material and access to it, one way to characterize the problem is to say, put it into essentially three boxes. The first two boxes go to countries. Countries in the first box that might leak fissile material. In other words, where governments don't wish to transfer the material, but because they have so much of it, they might not adequately control it. And the first country we think of, or traditionally have, is Russia, and that's where the non-Lugar cooperative threat reduction work actually was born, with the idea that we could collaborate with the Russians and help in the control of this material. And if, in fact, the non-Lugar stuff, the CTR stuff, is not renegotiated and is not restarted, I would say that would be a real shame and would increase the level of risk we all have to tolerate because the job is not done in controlling this material. Another country we worry about is Pakistan. Again, in terms of leakage, we're not putting a proposition out that government is going to transfer the material, but we all know the amount of material, both plutonium and highly enriched uranium in Pakistan, is increasing. The number of nuclear weapons being fabricated is increasing greatly, and we worry about this material not always remaining under firm governmental control inside Pakistan. So doing something about leakage is a problem and has not been adequately addressed. There's a second problem, and that is true transfer, the rogue transfer. And before anybody says this is just the stuff of movies, I remind you of 2007 and North Korea's transfer of a plutonium production reactor to that country, Syria, which went, as best I know, unpunished from the North Korean perspective. Yes, facility in Syria was flattened by an Israeli strike, but North Koreans probably were paid and have not been, best of my knowledge, been put on notice that this is something that should not ever be repeated. So there's a transfer issue and a possible road transfer issue from the North Koreans, and possibly our concern about Iran ought to go there as well. Finally, there's the energy source. There are countries that use plutonium as fuel, France being one of them, maybe the principal one, and our concern ought to be that China not adopt what's called thermal reactor recycle, the use of plutonium in the current generation of reactors when they build their reactors, that South Korea not embrace plutonium recycle. In other words, that the standard internationally be that plutonium will not be used as a fuel. It will be treated as waste and inside spent fuel, never reprocessed. Similarly, with highly enriched uranium, the best outcome, I think, would be for there to be no reason whatever to produce any more highly enriched uranium except for those countries who are declaring themselves continuing to build weapons, which I hope will be a diminishing number of countries. So if we could stop the production of fissile material for any purpose, highly enriched uranium or plutonium, it would be a great step forward. I put these all out there as objectives. They could be included in the nuclear security talks that happen, as they have in Washington and South Korea, and next will happen in the Netherlands. They could be addressed, and I think if we wanted to truly address the terrorism issue, we would have to go with them in something like the order I just described. Thank you.
Thank you all to the speakers. Now we will take questions. If you would like to ask a question, if you can please press 1. We will give it a minute for anyone who would like to. And just a reminder to everyone that this call is being recorded. We will have audio available after the call. So I'll just give 1 minute. And when you're called on, if you could please introduce yourself and, if possible, direct your question to one of the speakers. If not, we will make it work. So I'll just give 1 second. And our first question is from Mike Dorning. Mike, you're live.
Hello? Hello?
Mike?
Yeah, hi, it's Margaret Talib with Bloomberg calling on Mike's line.
Sorry.
We
will hold on him. Next question comes from Stephen Collinson of AFP.
Hi,
Steve,
thanks for the call. Given the fact that the U.S. and Russia are so at odds over Syria, and we're now in a position where they are almost arming different factions and they're fighting opposite factions, what expectation is there that they will be able to, show the pragmatism needed to work together on arms control issues? It seems, yep. Can you hear me?
Sir, are you asking me or are you asking Steve? Because we're not hearing Stephen Collinson on this.
I'm asking Steve Collinson.
Hi, can you hear me?
This is Mike.
Hello?
Thanks for calling back. I am writing about going to go to the G8 with their bombing. Lunch led until lunch. Briefing. Lunch led until
Hello?
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 Quickly.
Steve Collinson, can you ask your question one more time, please?
Yep, can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. It was basically a question on Syria, and given the fact that the U.S. and Russia are so at odds over what needs to happen in Syria, we're in a position now where they're basically arming opposing factions in this war. What expectation is there that they will be able to show the sort of bandwidth and pragmatism necessary to sit down and start crunching out a deal on arms control?
No, I think that's a really good question. It's interesting to me, at least the public reaction that you've seen so far out of Moscow seems to be a bit restrained in terms of the decision that was announced last night that the United States would be providing some weapons to the opposition. So I think there still is a chance for a conversation here. It does seem in the last several months that Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov have at least put in place the basis for a dialogue. Now, whether this actually produces something that is real remains to be seen. But again, if the sides want to do something on arms control, I think they can manage they can separate out the differences on Syria. It could contribute in an unhelpful way to the atmospherics. But if there's the bigger question, I think, on arms control is, do they want to do something on arms control on the Russian side?
Yeah, this is John. I agree with that. The Russians have shown that they can make agreement on arms control and segment out other issues, just as we disagreed over Iran and whether or not their program is designed for peaceful or military purposes, and we're at odds over a number of economic and strategic issues there. We're still able to cooperate in Afghanistan and on arms control. So, and I also think, while I've not spoken to anybody in the administration since last night, that it's reasonable to assume that the measured decision that was taken by the White House is designed in part to send a message to Russia, saying, we're not doing all we can. We do need your cooperation to make sure the Syrian situation doesn't get even worse, and there's still ground for cooperation that Secretary Kerry and Minister Lavrov have been working on.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Bloomberg News. Mike or Margaret, you are live.
Hey, sorry about that. Thanks for fixing the technical issues. I largely wanted to ask the same sort of question that Steve was asking, so I'll try not to be too repetitive. But while I know that the arms control is the long-term focus, in terms of Syria now and weapons, the addition of weapons to both sides, does that ratchet up the nuclear threat at all? And do you have any sense that there's any room for Russia and the U.S. to move closer together on Syria?
Well, I can maybe just address one part of that question and leave the other to Steve or Bob. I don't think there is any nuclear component to the Syria question at all, which is another example of why we can make significant reductions in nuclear weapons. The United States and Russia are not, even over an issue as complex and divisive as Syria, thinking about resorting to nuclear threats or even considering these as strategic challenges to us. And nuclear weapons, I think, are just largely irrelevant to the question of what's going on in Syria.
Yeah. And I would just add to that again, I think we'll have to see what comes out of the conversation on Monday between the two presidents directly on the question of Syria. But it does seem to me that while they are backing different sides, there also is an interest at play here in terms of containing their differences on Syria, if they wish to make progress on other questions. And the Russians in the past have shown themselves perfectly capable of compartmentalization, where you can differ on one issue and still work on other questions. But I don't think we're going to have a feeling for that until we see what comes out of the discussion Monday in Northern Ireland.
Thank you.
Thanks. Our next question comes from George Condon and just from CBS News. And just remember, if you'd like to ask a question, you can press 1. Thanks, George. You should be live.
Okay, thank you. First off, if I can ask you when you give your answers, if you can identify yourself, because it gets a little confusing sometimes. But I have two more general questions. One is, how would you characterize the state of the Obama-Putin relationship going into this? It was only a year ago where Putin refused to come to Camp David. And how is that relationship affected by the current surveillance, NSA controversy and disclosures?
Okay, well, this is Steve Piper. Let me take a first crack at that. I don't think you see, and I don't think anybody expected to see, the kind of fairly warm relationship that you saw between Barack Obama and Dmitry Medvedev. Putin's just not that kind of person. But having said that, I think the administration had a fairly clear understanding, even when Medvedev was president, that Putin was also the real power in the tandem. And I think there is an effort to be prepared to work with Putin, even though he may be a more difficult personality. Now, one thing I found a bit discouraging, Mr. Putin appeared on Russia Today on Wednesday of this week and seemed to go out of his way to take a couple of shots at the United States. It was not the most positive scene setter for the meeting in Northern Ireland. But again, at the end of the day, Putin's going to do a calculation whether cooperation with the U.S. on questions like arms control, other issues, serves his interest. And if he makes that calculation, I think he'll be prepared to sit down and bargain. On the question of the story about the leaks about NSA surveillance, my guess is that the Russians probably already had a fairly good idea of what the United States was doing and probably made assumptions as to what the United States was doing in part because the Russians, I believe, try to do very much of the same thing. So I don't think this is going to have a big impact on the discussion on Monday.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining. With that, we have no more questions. Thank you all for trudging through some of the technical issues. I'll refrain from any jokes about what sort of foreign or domestic hackery could have been happening. But thank you again. Again, this call is recorded. If you have any questions or would like to do any follow-up with the participants or follow-up next week, please feel free to contact me, Sarah Dubois, at National Security Network. You can reach me at press@nsnetwork.org or 202-289-7113. Thanks again.